The first thing I knew was the cold weight of the tube in my throat and the steady hiss of the machine breathing for me. I could not open my eyes. My fingers would not twitch. My body had become a heavy, unresponsive thing, but my hearing remained clear as glass. The ICU smelled of antiseptic and burnt plastic from the monitors. I floated somewhere between waking and dying. In that suspended place, I heard the scrape of a chair beside my bed, shoes on linoleum, then the familiar scent of his cologne, sharp and oily. My husband. His voice came next, pitched low like a secret, like a prayer, but every word cut like a scalpel. "If you really loved me," James whispered, his lips so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek, "you would die sooner. Give me the insurance money as your last gift. Otherwise you are nothing but a rotting corpse taking up space." The words entered my skull and stayed there. I could not flinch, could not gasp, could not push his face away. But inside me, something recoiled. He thought I was gone. He thought the tubes and the monitors made me deaf. He thought he was safe. I lay there, perfectly still, but each syllable etched itself into my memory like a nail into wood. He shifted in his chair, still talking, muttering about paperwork and deadlines and lawyers as if I were already buried. He brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, a mockery of tenderness, and added, "You lived long enough to ruin me. Now do me one last favor and make it quick." I felt my heart monitor skip, the beep accelerating, but I forced my breath to stay slow. Even trapped in my own body, I understood. This was not just betrayal. This was a plan. He had already decided who I was in the world, dead, and was arranging his new life on top of my silent body. My soul wanted to scream, but instead it whispered to itself, "Remember every word. Do not forget. Hold this like evidence." Around me the ICU hummed, nurses at the desk outside laughing at something on a screen, a patient moaning 2 beds down. My world had shrunk to the sound of his voice and the burning clarity of what it meant. He rose at last, chair scraping, footsteps retreating, the door clicking shut. The room felt even colder when he was gone. Machines hissed. My eyelids fluttered but would not rise. I pictured his face, that false expression of grief he wore for the nurses, and burned it into my mind. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. Because this was not the end. This was the moment I began my second life. I drifted in and out after that. Time in a coma is not linear. It comes in flashes and echoes. I heard doctors discussing my prognosis. Low chance of recovery, one said. Family should prepare. I heard James again once or twice, brisk and businesslike now, asking about signing forms, about moving forward. He no longer even tried to pretend at devotion. He was only waiting. And I waited too, in my dark prison, memorizing the sound of his boots as they walked away. I do not know how many days passed before another voice entered my world, soft and hesitant. A woman's voice, younger, almost musical. She did not sit as close, she did not touch me. She stood at the edge of the bed and whispered, "Mrs. Bennet?" A pause. "I am so sorry." Her fingers brushed my wrist, light as a moth's wing. "He told me you were gone. He told everyone. I did not know." Her touch lingered for a heartbeat, then withdrew. "If you wake up, if you want, contact me. A man like that is not worth 2 women's lives. We have to love ourselves first." I wanted to grab her hand, to squeeze it, to ask her name, but nothing in my body obeyed. Only my heart raced and the monitor kept beeping. She slipped something into my palm, cardboard, maybe a business card, and withdrew as quickly as she came. Her perfume was faint, clean, nothing like his heavy colognes. Then the door clicked shut again, and I was alone. But not the same. The machine still breathed for me, but my mind was no longer numb. It was awake. Every beep of the monitor became a vow. Remember, record, survive. He thought he was planning my death. He had no idea he was planting the seeds of his own undoing. In that bright, sterile room that smelled of bleach and betrayal, I began to build my escape in silence. I could not speak, I could not move, but I could still think. and I thought of everything he had taken and everything I would take back. That was the first day of my second life, and the last day James Bennett would ever be safe from the truth. They used to call me Mrs. Bennett. Back then, it meant something. I had a husband, a home, a name that carried weight in the community, at least, that is what I told myself. Truth is, I gave up my own name long before I signed it on marriage papers. My maiden name was Granger, Marjorie Granger. The Grangers had land passed down from great-grandparents who tilled it with their own hands. After I married James, I sold that land for him, every acre. It will help us start fresh, I told my father, swallowing the lump in my throat. James has a vision. We're going to build something bigger. What we built was a company. Bennett Systems, named after him, not us. I wrote the first checks, managed the first payroll, swept the floors in our first office. I filed paperwork while he courted clients with charm and cologne. He always knew how to smile like he meant it. I believed in him. When the business took off, everyone praised James, the young upstart, the visionary, the man who came from nothing. They never mentioned the woman who mortgaged her family's name. We never had children. Not for lack of trying. I had 2 miscarriages and 1 surgery that ended the hope altogether. The last time, I remember lying on the bathroom floor, blood pooling beneath me, and whispering, "I'm sorry." James stood at the door. He didn't step in. Just stood there in his tailored pants and polished shoes and said, "Don't cry. It's not like you lost anything that was really there." From then on, I learned to carry my grief quietly. His family never forgave me for the empty cradle. His mother called me unlucky. His sister said I was barren in more ways than one. At holidays, I'd sit at the end of the table while they passed around baby photos of their growing broods. I smiled until my jaw ached. As I aged, I faded in their eyes. Once I was the investor, the planner, the woman with the calculator and the vision. Then I became the old one, the woman who walked too slowly, who didn't understand digital strategy, whose ideas were old school. James began excluding me from meetings. He said, "You don't need the stress, Marjorie. Go rest. Take a trip." Rest? From what? Being erased? Eventually, I stopped going to the office. My name was never on the paperwork anyway. One day, I found the key card to the building had been deactivated. When I called James to ask, he said, "There's been a lot of restructuring. You wouldn't understand." I laughed. I had structured the damn thing from day one. That was when I thought about leaving. I packed a suitcase. I found an attorney. I even had a rental lined up, a tiny apartment by the river. I told James I wanted to talk. He poured us drinks. I told him I wasn't happy. He looked at me with that cool, polished gaze and said, "After everything I've done for you, you'd walk away now? What would people say?" Then came the real blow. "You're too old to start over, Marjorie, and too guilty to live with it. Who else would love you now?" I put the suitcase back in the closet, not because I believed him, but because I believed in guilt. I believed that I had failed as a wife, as a woman, as a mother, and failing women don't deserve exits. They deserve silence. That's what I told myself for years. Until the day he told the world I was dead. That was the part that undid me. He didn't just erase my name from the company, he erased it from life itself. He told colleagues I'd passed away peacefully, donated money in my name, held a private memorial, without my body, of course, told everyone I had wanted it this way. I saw the proof when I woke up in the hospital. A nurse showed me a charity article, "In memory of Marjorie Bennett, the quiet woman behind the empire." My photo beside his. A grainy image from our 10th anniversary party, the last one where I still wore red lipstick. He took my silence and turned it into a coffin, buried me in public memory so he could start again with a clean slate. Nadia was part of that fresh coat of paint. Young, elegant, a nurse with kind eyes and a soft laugh. I saw a picture of them online, James beaming in his tuxedo, Nadia holding a bouquet. They had married while I was still tethered to machines. She wore my ring. I could have broken apart at that moment, but something inside me did not crack, it crystallized. He took everything I gave and still said I was not enough. but now I knew something he didn't. I was still here, still alive, still listening. He had written me off like a debt. And debts, eventually, come due. When you come back from the edge of death, there is no bright trumpet, no movie light. There is just the weight of your own body, the slow drag of breath that feels like hauling a stone uphill, the ache of tubes in your skin. That was how I woke up. Not with a gasp, but with a soft flicker of pain behind my eyes. I blinked, once, twice. The ceiling tiles above me were a patchwork of gray squares. The sound of machines that had been my only companions now seemed louder, as if someone had turned up the volume on the world. My lips cracked when I tried to move them. My fingers twitched. I was still there. I was still alive. My mind swam through the memory of his voice, James's voice, whispering poison into my ear. I wondered how long I had been gone. Days? Weeks? The light at the window told me it was morning, but my sense of time had been smashed to pieces. A nurse came in, not the same one from before, and smiled faintly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Bennet," she said softly, adjusting my IV. Her badge read Elaine. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes darted nervously to the bedside table, as if there was something there she did not want me to see. When she left, I turned my head slowly, muscles protesting, and looked. There, propped neatly against the water jug, was a glossy photograph. A wedding photograph. James in a tuxedo, smiling the smile he once used to win investors. Nadia beside him, veil trailing down her shoulders, bouquet in her hand, his arm wrapped tight around her waist like possession. The caption printed at the bottom, "A new chapter for Bennett & Co." I stared at it until my vision blurred. For a moment I thought it was a fever dream, some cruel hallucination conjured by my damaged brain. But no, the paper was real. The faces were real. The date printed in the corner was from just 2 weeks ago. I tried to sit up. My arms trembled. The IV tugged at my skin. The heart monitor beeped faster, warning me not to push, but I pushed anyway. My breath came in shallow bursts. I wanted to rip the photo apart, to throw it across the room, but my fingers were too weak to even reach for it. The door opened again. 2 orderlies passed by, wheeling a cart, murmuring about Mrs. Bennett's miraculous recovery. One of them whispered, "Did you hear? He remarried already. Poor lady doesn't even know." They moved on before I could make a sound. I turned back to the photo. James had told everyone I was dead. He had forged a death certificate. It was the only way to marry again without raising suspicion. And Nadia, with her soft voice and clean perfume, had believed him. She had no reason not to. I closed my eyes. The machines hissed. My pulse hammered in my ears. This was the moment I thought, so this is it. I woke up not to life, but to a funeral for my own marriage. I felt tears slide down my temples into my hair. Not tears of grief, I had already grieved him in silence for years, but tears of something colder, resolve. A shadow crossed the doorway. Soft steps approached. The scent that followed was not James's heavy cologne, but something lighter. I opened my eyes and saw Nadia standing at the foot of the bed, out of her nurse's uniform, wearing a plain dress, her face pale. She looked at me as if seeing a ghost. "I didn't know," she whispered. Her voice shook. "He told me you were gone. He showed me papers. I didn't know." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small white card, hesitated, then placed it gently on the blanket near my hand. "If you wake up, if you can, contact me. A man like that isn't worth 2 women's lives." She glanced at the photograph on the table, then at me again. "I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes glistening, and slipped out as quietly as she had come. I stared at the card. The letters on it swam until I blinked hard and focused. A phone number, an email address, a name I had never known she had. It felt like a lifeline disguised as a scrap of paper. My fingers twitched toward it, but the IV line held me back. Outside the window, a gull cried over the harbor. Somewhere in the hospital, a child laughed. Life continued. And here I lay, a living woman declared dead, watching my husband build a new life on top of my grave. I turned my head back to the photograph and whispered, barely audible even to myself, "You think you've buried me, but you've only planted me." My heart monitor beeped slower now, steadier. I lay back against the pillow, card still on the blanket like a secret waiting for a hand strong enough to hold it. This was not the return I had imagined, but it was the return I would use. He thought I would die quietly. Instead, I would rise quietly. And one day soon, when my hands were steady and my voice was back, I would make sure everyone who toasted his new chapter knew exactly whose pages he had torn out to write it. I moved into the small house on Sycamore Street with nothing but a suitcase and a fire in my chest. It was barely furnished, just a sofa, a cot, a table. But for the first time in years, I had a place that was mine. No James, no echoes of his voice hanging in the curtains. Just me, my bruised spirit, and a plan forming with every breath I drew. The first thing I did was buy cameras. Small ones, discreet, no bigger than a button. I placed one in my entryway, one above the dining room, and hid another inside the spine of an old book on the shelf. Microphones, too. I learned fast. You would be surprised how much you can absorb when you've spent a life being told to stay out of the way. I'd stayed out of the way long enough. Now, I was watching. The second thing I did was call Samuel Reed. He had helped me draft a will a few years ago, back when James had a health scare, and I'd briefly believed in honesty between spouses. Samuel was sharp, the kind of man who always read the fine print twice. When I called, I only had to say one sentence: "James married again while I was in a coma, and he told me to come in the next morning." Samuel didn't blink. "We'll start by re-establishing your legal status as living. Then we trace the marriage license. After that, we document everything." He handed me a folder. Inside were templates for affidavits, a checklist for asset tracking, and space to log dates and audio files. It was the first time I'd felt like someone was handing me back a piece of power. A week passed, then another. I drank weak tea in my quiet house, cataloging every memory like an archivist preparing for battle. Each morning, I walked slowly to the mailbox, my knees not what they once were, and checked for updates from Samuel. Each evening, I played the day's recordings, sorting through voices, picking out moments that might matter. James hadn't reached out. Of course he hadn't. In his mind, I was still buried in some metaphorical ground. And then, one morning, an email came through. Nadia. She had used the contact card she left me, and it simply said, "Can we talk? Something's not right." We met at a diner near the waterfront. She wore a scarf, sunglasses, like someone trying to hide and failing. Her hands trembled around the mug of coffee. "I checked the marriage license," she said. "The date's off. It says I married James 2 days before you came out of your coma, but the documents he showed me said you'd been dead for weeks. It doesn't match." I nodded but said nothing. "There's more," she whispered, leaning in. "He listed his brother as the backup beneficiary on his company shares, and I'm not even on the insurance policy," I asked. He told me not to worry about money. Then he changed the subject. My throat was tight, but I reached into my purse and pulled out a small flash drive. "Listen to this," I said. That night, in the safety of her apartment, Nadia plugged the drive into her laptop. I watched her face change as James's voice filled the room. "She's useful for now, but the plan was always about consolidation. Once things are secure, it's just me. I didn't marry for love. I married for leverage." Nadia's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled. He said that about me?" I nodded slowly. "He said worse about me." We sat in silence for a moment. 2 women, 2 ghosts of the same man's making. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. "I did," I said honestly, "but only because I didn't know you were also drowning." Camaraderie comes in strange forms. Sometimes it's born from war, sometimes from fire, and sometimes, like that night, it's born from betrayal that cuts 2 people along the same wound. We decided to combine what we knew. Nadia had access. I had evidence. She would keep playing the obedient wife while slipping me updates. I would keep documenting everything: the calls, the transfers, the whispers behind closed doors. The next week, she recorded him again. This time, he was speaking to his brother on speakerphone. "She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. Then it's just clean up. By year end, everything's mine. Hell, I might even move on again, trade up. That was when Nadia broke down. She played the file for me, hands shaking, tears running silently. He used us both, she said, voice cracking. He never loved either of us. I reached across the table and took her hand. No, I said, but we love ourselves enough now to end it. This was the turning point, the line between victims and survivors. And from here on, James Bennett would learn what happens when the women he thought were weak rise from the ashes, not to beg, but to burn what tried to bury them. Justice would not arrive with rage, it would arrive with receipts. And James, oh James, he left a long, loud trail. I started wearing a shawl, even when it was hot. Let my hands tremble a bit more in front of people, let my sentences drift off, as if I had forgotten what I meant to say. When James's brother stopped by, to check on the paperwork, I kept my eyes distant and called him by the wrong name. Poor thing, I heard him mutter as he left, she's not all there. Exactly what I wanted. James, for his part, was so confident in his victory, he practically hummed when he visited. You look tired, he said sweetly, placing a stack of papers on my table. Don't stress yourself. Just sign these. It's all standard, just some estate adjustments and closure forms. I reached for the pen, like my arm weighed 50 pounds. My hand hovered above the line. If I sign, I asked, voice thin, everything's taken care of? Of course, he cooed, smoothing my hair. You just rest. Let your husband take care of it all, like always. He didn't know Nadia was watching from behind the hallway door, phone in hand. He didn't know that Samuel had set up a small camera in the lampshade 2 nights ago. He didn't know I had already signed a document revoking any previous powers of attorney, witnessed and notarized in the quiet safety of my lawyer's office. These papers? They were bait. Modified copies, designed not to give away assets, but to collect proof of coercion. So I signed, slowly, pretending to forget which page was which. James pointed helpfully, his voice thick with false patience. Every second, every word, every condescending pat of his hand was caught on video and audio. When he left that afternoon, he kissed my forehead. Thank you, he said, with mock tenderness. You're doing the right thing. I'll make sure everything's handled. I waited until his car was out of the driveway. Then I stood up straight, took off the shawl, and pulled out my phone. It's done, I told Nadia. The next day, James went to the company lawyer to finalize what he believed was a smooth internal transfer of shares. He signed with a flourish, unaware that his version of the documents had been substituted for one we prepared. One that detailed, in full, his manipulation of a vulnerable spouse, accompanied by video proof and multiple witness testimonies. The moment he put his signature down was the moment his noose tightened. Samuel and I had arranged a time-stamped delivery. The moment James filed the papers, copies were sent to the state's Financial Crimes Division, our civil court judge, and 2 investigative journalists who'd already expressed interest in the miraculous widow's return story. Nadia texted me later that day. He's celebrating, thinks he won, popped champagne. I filmed it. I stared at her message, then at the sun slipping down behind my small garden. He had signed his future away with the same pen he once used to sign our wedding certificate, only this time the contract was real. There was no need for screaming, no confrontation. I had learned in silence, learned how to listen, how to wait. And now, he was the one walking blind. Justice, I had come to understand, does not always shout. Sometimes it signs. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but I arrived with Samuel and Nadia at 9:45 sharp. I stood just outside the glass doors of the executive boardroom, waiting. My reflection in the glass was steadier than I expected. No tremble in my hands, no flutter in my chest. Just breath. Controlled. Certain. Inside, James stood at the head of the long polished table, dressed like a man preparing to be crowned. His navy suit was new. The smile he wore, practiced. He cleared his throat, spreading a series of charts across the table. As many of you know, he began, we've had an internal restructuring. Certain estate-related matters have been finalized, and I'm pleased to announce a consolidation of leadership under my direction. Polite claps, nod from his brother, a few tight smiles from longtime partners. Nadia sat quietly near the back, her face blank. She wore the same gold wedding band she had promised to remove only hours before. Timing, we had agreed, was everything. James continued, his tone silky. With my late wife's affairs now legally resolved, and the transition behind us, it's time for a new chapter. Samuel Reed stood up. I apologize, he said calmly. But before any votes or announcements proceed, I've been instructed to submit documentation that impacts Mr. Bennett's authority and ownership standing. James's face twitched, just once. Samuel placed a flash drive into the conference room's screen system. The lights dimmed slightly as the video began. First, James's voice, unmistakable, from the lamp camera in my living room. You just sign these, darling. You're tired. Let your husband take care of everything. You don't even need to read. Next, the phone call to his brother. She's still breathing but useless. I'll marry Nadia, and once the paperwork clears, we'll clean it all up. Then, the cruelest one, the ICU recording. If she loves me, she'll just die already. That's the last favor she owes me. Her body's just holding up my life. Gasps around the room. A woman from HR covered her mouth. One of the senior shareholders shook his head in stunned disbelief. James surged forward. That's out of context. Nadia stood up. No, she said clearly, her voice ringing across the room. It's exactly who you are. She removed the gold ring, held it in the air, and let it fall onto the glass table with a sharp clink. I don't need to be married to a man who wished his wife dead for money. More murmurs. Shock turned into anger. And as for me, Nadia added, I was lied to, told Marjorie was gone, that she'd died in her sleep. Samuel turned to the door and nodded. That was my cue. I walked in. I didn't speak at first. Just stood there, my cane tapping softly against the tile floor, my eyes scanning the faces of people who had either forgotten me or believed the obituary James had crafted. James froze, his lips parted. I'm not a ghost, I said. Not yet. No one moved. It was as if the air had stopped circulating. I approached the table and pulled from my purse a folded, yellowing piece of paper. This, I said, is a copy of Ruth Bennett's private directive, my late mother-in-law. You'll note the clause near the bottom. Should James Bennett be found in violation of any criminal or ethical code, his shares are to be forfeited immediately and reassigned to the spouse of record. I set the document next to Nadia, and this woman was never that. James lunged for the paper. Samuel stepped between us. You've signed evidence of coercion, committed marriage fraud, lied to legal institutions, and that's before we get to your tax records, which our financial investigator found colorful. The doors opened again. 2 uniformed officers stepped in. James Bennett, one of them announced, you are under arrest for attempted insurance fraud, falsifying legal documents, obstruction of justice, and suspicion of attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. He didn't remain silent. You can't do this to me, he shouted as they cuffed his wrists. You're all traitors. She's manipulating you. This is a setup. Marjorie, for God's sake, I built this company. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. Not with hate, not with love, but with the quiet power of someone who was never meant to survive, let alone win. He thrashed once more before being led out, his yells echoing down the hall. I turned to the shareholders, some of whom still sat wide-eyed, others scribbling notes or reaching for their phones. You may call this revenge, I said, but I call it correction. And then I walked out, slowly, deliberately, into the clean, cold October light. They changed the name of the company the following week, quietly, almost embarrassed. Bennett Holdings became Oaktide Group. A new logo, a statement to the press about a shift toward transparency and integrity. James's name was scrubbed from the official site by Thursday, from founder to footnote. The court froze his assets. Investigators found discrepancies stretching back a decade. 2 homes bought under shell names, offshore transfers, Not just betrayal, but a pattern of rot. I did not return to the company. I had no desire to sit in boardrooms filled with people who had smiled while I disappeared. Samuel asked if I wanted a role on the oversight committee. I thanked him and declined. "I'll take the little white house off Folly Road," I told him. "It's quiet. It's mine." It had a garden and a screened-in porch. I planted marigolds the first day, sunflowers the next. One by one, the relatives came. A niece who hadn't called in 15 years knocked on my door with banana bread. "I always knew something was off," she said, eyes a little too wide. "James he didn't seem right, you know." I looked at her, then asked, "When he told people I was a useless old body just wasting space, were you in the room?" Her smile froze. Well, I didn't know he meant it." "Did you ask him not to?" She blinked. I closed the door softly. Others followed. Cousins, a godson, a second cousin twice removed who once asked if my infertility made me feel like less of a woman. I asked them all the same question. When James called me a rotting corpse, who among you said, "That's enough"? No one had an answer, and I had no space left for their silence. Nadia and I filed the paperwork together. Her hand didn't shake when she signed her name. Mine didn't either. The judge looked confused, seeing us both on the same bench. 2 wives, 1 past, 1 future. "He lied to us both," she said simply. "We're not enemies. We're evidence." A few weeks later, she moved into a house just down the street from mine, smaller, with blue shutters and a hammock out back. We had dinner on Wednesdays. No forced smiles, no pretending to be family, just 2 women who had been lied to and who now knew how to live without apology. Sometimes, when we walked the neighborhood trail together, people would glance and whisper, maybe wondering which one of us was the real wife. We'd just laugh, because the answer didn't matter anymore. He lost everything. We didn't just survive. We redefined what it meant to walk away whole. We named it Widow's Wake, though not all the women we helped had been married. Some had never made it down the aisle. Some had buried husbands. Some had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a paper trail of debt left behind in their names. But all of them had been silenced. By husbands, by systems, by fear, by love twisted into obligation, by the voice in their own heads that whispered, "Maybe I deserved it." Widow's Wake was born one October afternoon at my kitchen table. I had brewed jasmine tea. Nadia brought lemon squares and an old notebook with half the pages torn out. "Let's start with names," she said. "Women we know who need help but don't know how to ask." By January, we had a nonprofit license. By March, we had a website, a small staff, and 3 clients. I paid for it with the settlement from James's seized accounts, money I had once imagined using to grow old beside him. Now, it built legal defenses, secured emergency housing, funded therapy. Every Friday, Nadia wrote a newsletter. Every Wednesday, I reviewed new cases. And every Monday morning, without fail, we sat on my porch with our mugs. We never said his name. Not out of pain, but because he was no longer relevant. We talked about single mothers fighting landlords, about a woman in Beaufort who left with 3 kids and the neighbor's dog after her husband drained her $401k, about a grandmother who discovered her son had mortgaged her house while she was recovering from surgery. We laughed, we cried, we plotted and organized. It felt more like ministry than vengeance. At night, I'd sit with the lamp on low and look through the thank you cards. Some handwritten, some printed from computers at public libraries. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for believing that financial abuse is real. Thank you for teaching me I'm not too old to start again. I had been all those women once. Silent, afraid, ashamed of needing too much, apologizing for my presence, for my age, for my body's refusal to give life when life was expected of me. James had once said I was dead weight. Now, my name was listed on something alive, and every month our client list grew. People started calling Nadia a miracle worker. They said she had a way of making them feel human again. She smiled, always giving credit to An older friend who once woke up at her own funeral and decided to plan her resurrection instead. That older friend was me. We hosted our first fundraiser at a local community center. Cheap wine, tea lights, plastic chairs. But by the end of the night, we had raised enough to cover 5 new cases. I stood up to thank the room. "I did not die in that coma," I said. "I was just listening, gathering every word, every lie, every hope you whispered near me, thinking I could not hear. And when I woke, I remembered." A hush fell. "Justice does not always shout," I continued. "Sometimes it just waits for its moment, waits for the silence to crack." I looked at the women, some young, some older than me. "Do not wait for men to rescue you. Rescue yourselves, like I did, like Nadia did, like you will." They clapped, not loudly, but with a kind of reverence I had never felt when I sat quietly beside James at board meetings or family dinners. Afterward, a girl no older than 20 whispered, "You made me believe I can leave." That night, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because of grief, but because I had become who I needed when I was younger. We still drink tea on Mondays, still take slow walks on Thursdays. And sometimes, when the sun sets just right, I imagine the version of me that never woke up. The woman who would have been buried with her silence, her secrets, and the name of a man who only saw her as an obstacle. I smile at that thought, because that woman never got the chance to fight back. But I did, and I used it. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a truth, or a quiet kind of strength, don't forget to subscribe to Grandma True Stories. These aren't just tales. They're lived lives, whispered from porches and hospital beds, and carried in the silence of women who've endured too much for too long. Every click, every share, every hype helps keep our voices alive, not for pity, but for power. Because when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens. We'll be waiting here with another story, just like this one.